Howdy everyone, you're listening to Blue Jeans and Boots, where genetics grad students talk about how to navigate a Ph.D. program while trying to stay sane. We also invite faculty from our interdisciplinary program here at Texas A&M or researchers outside A&M onto the show to pick their brains about their research, what it's like being a principal investigator, and their journey to becoming a professor here at A&M or anywhere else. In this episode, we'll be talking to Dr. Bruce Walsh. Dr. Walsh is an Ecology and Evolutionary Biology professor at the University of Arizona. He earned his Ph.D. in genetics at the University of Washington and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Chicago and the University of California, Davis. His research uses mathematical models to better understand the evolution of genetics and complex traits. My name is Serina, and I'll be one of your hosts today.
And my name is Emmarie, and I'll be your other host today.
Welcome to the show, Dr. Walsh.
Thank you. I should say howdy.
Howdy.
Howdy doody.
So we were discussing, sorry everybody, before we started this episode, we got to all have lunch together, and we've been talking extensively about, birds, plants, moths, mammals,
Hyraxes.
pretty much everything.
Yeah, hyraxes. Hyraxes are the highlight.
Yes, hyraxes.
Pangolins.
Pangolins. So many pangolins.
One of you spell hyraxes so that people can Google it, because I didn't know what that was.
Hyrax. You are welcome.
Okay,
It's
wonderful.
so cute.
So cute.
I just found out it is quite cute. Can't confirm. Awesome. So is there anything, Dr. Walsh, that you don't know about? Because I'm convinced at this point that you know about almost everything.
Well, so we talked about the infinitesimal model in my talk, where each gene has a really tiny effect, but there's the infinitesimal sum to something small. I'm an infinitesimal biologist. I know an incredibly tiny amount about a huge amount of stuff.
That's
so together it comes
cool.
to a little tiny bit. But I've always been a biologist. I started out as a butterfly collector and then got into mathematics because I thought I noticed, as a teenager, some years species were down and some years they were up. And I thought maybe you could model that mathematically. That turned out to be wrong. And then I got into genetics, but I've always been a biologist at heart.
Oh, wow. So you were a butterfly collector when you were a teenager?
Probably like 10 years old.
Cool.
Wow. That's pretty interesting. Where did you grow up? Were there a lot of butterflies where you grew up?
I grew up in the Carmel Valley area in central California on the coast. And it was great because I could hop over my backyard, fence in the backyard, and be in the foothills, and did a lot of collecting and learned a lot of plants, and found weird caterpillars, and just did the things that unfortunately a lot of kids don't get to do these days, which is just get smacked in the face by nature.
That's true, honestly.
True. Yeah.
It's sadly true.
Yeah.
No, definitely. So that is the origin of your sort of biology interest. Mm-hmm. Once you were interested in genetics, did you study genetics in your undergraduate, or how did you get into sort of where you're at now?
So I went to undergrad school at Davis, and I went to work with someone named Art Shapiro, who's a butterfly person.
Oh, wonderful.
And Art hates mathematics and was quite disappointed to learn that I'm the one that got him interested in, he's the one that got me interested in mathematical modeling. And then I found out about my end of my first semester that Davis had an individual majors program. And the nice thing is you could tailor a program, but even more importantly, you could tailor it in such a way that almost all the requirements were taken out as long as you had rigor. So I ended up getting a degree in mathematical population biology.
Oh, cool.
So I took probably 115 credits of math and a whole bunch of biology and a bunch of other stuff.
Wow.
So it was a fun way to get a degree and to learn a bunch of different things. And I've always been interested in biology, and math is one way to look at biology, but so is physiology, so is chemistry, so is geography, geology, actually astronomy. There's a lot of interesting astrobiology stuff that's going on now. So I'm interested in life as a process, and it's just fascinating.
Awesome.
That's really interesting. I feel like there's always distinct camps sometimes of biologists where they're like, I don't want to do mathematics, or I don't want to do bioinformatics, or I don't want to do this or this or that. So it's interesting to hear that there's a merging, I guess, of the two different disciplines in your research and what you enjoy. But yeah.
But the way to think about biology is, my department is Ecology, Evolutionary Biology. And in the 70s, we were the first department to break up the old botany, zoology model and focus more on process. Mm-hmm. So we had a botany and zoology program before I got there, and we merged it into ecology and evolution, which is now kind of the standard model. So I would think, don't think about camps or tools. Think about what problems you want to address. Those problems may lead you into certain model systems. So you may end up in a lab that works on plant mating systems and and lizard sex chromosomes, because they're underlying common questions. And the question should drive the tools you need. You shouldn't basically have like one hammer and go around looking for nails. You should have an interesting, like for example, think about ant behavior, right? Ant behavior, well, you could think about that as chemistry. You could think about that as evolution. You could think about that as genetic because they're haplodiploid. You could think about that in terms of mathematical modeling of insects as automatons, right? You can think about that in a spatial scale about where the nest has different brood chambers. You can think about how that interacts with climate. So once you get, a study organism or study system, you're only limited by your imagination where you want to attack them. And that naturally leads you into things like learning some bioinformatics or learning some, chromatography or learning some genomics or learning some ultrasound recording or high-speed camera recording.
Mm-hmm. What is an automaton?
What's that?
The mathematical word that you used? For the ants?
So one way to model, a common modeling technique is you model every unit as an individual actor, that when it bumps into some other individual actors, what it does, back, forward, move forward, move back.
Okay.
So that kind of, modeling is often done. And how do you get these complex behaviors out of simple behaviors? Well, you can get a lot of them by just what a complex system would look like when you simulate it.
Ah, okay. I understand. Not a very mathematically inclined person, I have to admit. I am not great at math, so I'd never heard that word before.
Well, so let me try to change your mind on that a bit.
Okay.
I think most people are actually good at math. Number one, they don't feel they are, and number two, they've often had really crummy teachers.
That's fair.
Like oftentimes math is taught as here are the multiplication tables, or here's how to memorize how to use the chain rule, rather than drawing a graph about what a derivative or an integral is. Or rather than draw a little figure to talk about probability. Why is there a factor of 2 here? We draw a little figure. Oh, okay. It can happen 2 different ways. So I think most people are intrinsically better at math than they realize, and they often haven't gotten good instruction. And there are a number of tremendously good math videos on YouTube from all different levels of expertise. I watch them all the time and learn new interesting things all the time. So I think that the biggest thing math phobia is people think, well, it's okay because I'm not good at it. When in fact, you probably are if it's taught right and you think about problems correctly. So, it's important not to shut off any door. Like I'm terrible at languages. I have a speaking issue, slight dyslexia. So I can't learn languages, but all the insects I work on have these complicated Latin names I've got to kind of struggle through. But I do it because I enjoy it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
So you had mentioned during lunch that you teach an undergraduate course for biology.
I do. I teach intro bio.
Okay. Do you incorporate math into your lectures?
I do.
Okay.
In fact, my favorite thing is the very first day. So I'm in a lecture hall. I usually do 2 of them. And I have 400 plus students in there. They're all eager. They're all freshmen. Unlike A&M, the next day, half of them are gone because lectures are online. They come back during the midterms and don't do well. So pro tip, go to class, take notes, you'll do much better. But the very first day I walk up and say, who wants to work on cetaceans? And literally everybody, who doesn't want to work on cetaceans, dolphins and whales? Everyone's hand goes up. So I then ask, who knows what a Fourier transform is? All the hands drop and there's an engineer sitting in front taking a lecture that waves their hand. And I say, that's the person that's going to work on cetaceans. And I use that to make people realize that, biology is very competitive. Who doesn't want to work on whales and dolphins? Well, what gives you an opportunity to do that? You've got unique skills. Fourier transforms are how you break down signals into components, so communication. And I always do that, and I get feedback, and my favorite feedback was about 2 years ago. I got an email from a student, very nice student, and she, after I mentioned that, she came up and said, I don't know what I'm going to do. Do you have any math to suggest? And I said, take a basic linear algebra course. Take a basic probability course. And I got an email from her several years later saying she'd just been admitted to the MD Ph.D. program in epidemiology at Johns Hopkins. And it was because she decided to take that first linear algebra class and just took off from there.
Wow.
So I never, when I teach a big class like that, I never worry about affecting everyone. I worry about affecting those that small subset of people that don't realize just how much potential they have. And if every instructor did that, collectively, we'd capture a lot more people.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right. Did you have a teacher that did that for you with math? or with
Not
biology?
really. So my major advisor was Joe Felsenstein, who's very well known for phylogenetic systematics. And Joe had amazing insight. He could always take a very complicated problem and make it simple. And he called it Felsenstein. Well, we called it Felsenstein's rule. My member of my committee was a theoretician named Monty Slatkin, who's well known in population genetics. And he had what he called Slatkin's corollary, because Joe would say that, after the fact, everything is obvious. And Monty would say, yes, but before the fact, incorrect things are very obvious. So and the key to thinking about working with math is to think simply. So one of the best mathematical modelers ever in biology is John Maynard Smith. Game theory, evolution of sex. And John had this incredible knack of taking very complicated problems and distilling the essence and making a very simple, almost algebraic model to how to solve them. Because the biggest mistake you can make in mathematical modeling is to over-model a system. It has no generality. You're looking for general features. Why do we have sex when if you're female, you can have twice as many offspring if you self? So now, so there are models that look at that and try to get to that. The other big people that did that in population genetics, Jim Crow and Moto Kimura. Moto was an amazing mathematician. And rumor has it that he was up for Crow was going to nominate him and Sewell Wright for the Nobel Prize. But I think Crow died that year, so he wasn't for it. He may not have gotten it, obviously, but he was an amazing mathematician. But Crow had a knack of asking the right questions, and he would give them to Kimura, who would then mathematically figure them out. So a lot of it is think about the problem and think about the math that captures the essence of the problem without getting so bogged down in the details, and that gets you a long way. Because you can always build upon it once you make a simple model, but that simple model often tells you a lot.
So as someone who uses math so heavily in their research, has there ever been any sort of collaborative questions that you've answered with another person where you were the mathematician and they did maybe something else?
Yeah, I do. Most of my collaborators are informal in that I don't seek authorship. I kind of guide people in the right direction and say, try this or try that, and I'm here if you need help and stuff like that. One of the mistakes people make when they approach a mathematician or a mathematical biologist is they have an overspecified problem.
Okay.
For example, the problem should be, why don't birds lay eggs earlier? Because there's an advantage to laying eggs earlier. Versus, why don't blue jays in the scrublands of West Texas during dry years lay eggs earlier, right? You want to capture because if you capture a simple problem, it's much more generalizable. And once you have that basic generalization, you can then add on the details of your specific system. And so I think if you want to approach someone for modeling, really spend a lot of time and think, even if you think it simplistically, about what question I'm trying to ask. And just trying to frame that question will often give you a lot more structure and insight.
Why is it better for birds to lay eggs earlier?
Trade-off, because the answer turns out to be interestingly complicated. So Mark Kirkpatrick at UT and Steve Arnold and I think it was Russ Landy basically figured out it was you had maternal effects had some component involved in that. And so the model is actually nicely described in chapter 20 of our 2018 book, which I can't remember offhand.
Awesome. Okay. Excellent. Could you tell us a little bit about the research you are doing now incorporating biology and math and sort of what you're most excited about?
Sure. So I'm actually in a really odd position and not many people can do that. And I don't mean that, in a conceited way. It's just that what I mainly do is I do synthetic stuff. Mm-hmm. And so you can only have a couple of people like that in the field because you have to have people generating the data. Mm-hmm. So what I'm doing now is I'm kind of revising our textbooks on quantitative genetics, which is basically anything that has any trait that shows variation. Any trait.
Wow.
And so what that means is I spend equal amounts of time talking to human geneticists, mm-hmm. to plant breeders, to animal breeders, to evolutionary biologists, to genomicists, to statisticians. And so it's a fun network to get involved with, and because it's so time-consuming trying to, talk to a systems biologist and a maize breeder and a theoretical population geneticist all at the same time, it kind of takes up I don't have a lot of free disk space up there, and I have limiting processing power, so that kind of takes up all my time. But it's incredibly fun because you're making all these connections and showing how these disparate ideas actually kind of fit together nicely. And I'm a real fond believer in teaching. I think the mark that I will leave is not research, but rather giving people the tools and understanding how to ask problems on their own and let them know where some previous mistakes have been made and where some previous successes are. Because there's nothing more exciting than, giving, it's the old thing about you can, give them a fish or you can teach them how to fish. And, you teach people how to think critically and how to use some basic quantitative skills. And if they have a passion for their question of their organism, then you've done your job because they'll take care of the rest.
So I was going to say, you had mentioned that you're currently revising these textbooks. You, alongside Dr. Michael Lynch, wrote really two of the big books that sort of formally synthesize the field of quantitative genetics.
The second one was 8.5 pounds.
Yeah.
More weight than an average baby.
Why did you guys weigh it? You just saw the pages and you were like, all right,
well, no,
time to weigh?
When I printed out on my computer, I hadn't realized it was almost 3.5 inches thick.
So you guys had a baby. You wrote a baby.
Yeah.
You wrote a baby. Yeah.
And what we're doing now is the our 1998 book, Genetics and Analysis of Quantitative Traits. We're totally revising that now because so much has happened in the last 20 years.
Wow.
So our first book is about 900 pages, and it's 5 by 7 pages. So we finished the first part of the revision. It's 1,000 pages at 8.5 by 11. And we've added about 1,200 new references post 2000 because the field has changed so much.
Yeah.
But it's been incredibly fun reading the human literature and the bioinformatics literature and seeing how that the animal people really got runs of homozygosity and the plant people really figured out cute ways to do G by E. And it's just kind of fun putting all those together. And it means at any meeting, it's really fun because I can talk to anybody and I can learn something really interesting. And occasionally I can say, hey, you might think about doing it this way because you're a human geneticist, but the plant breeders use this technique, which is actually pretty successful because they wouldn't have seen it. So that's always fun to make those connections as well.
That is really cool. So what was your actual initial motivation behind writing those books back in the 90s?
I was interested in it.
Okay.
I've always been interested in, I'm interested in everything, and especially everything in biology. And so I'm just kind of like a tar ball rolling down a hill where you get more and more stuff stuck to you.
Yeah.
You want to keep on rolling and not get so bloated that you can't move anywhere.
Yeah.
But if you really want to be a scientist, you're not in it for the fame, you're not in it for the money, you're in it for the passion.
Yeah.
And you're in it because there's something that you love. And I still can't believe, when I get up to go to work, it's I got to go and do stuff. I can't wait to do that. There are occasional days I got to grade a final, but usually it's you have that excitement. I just can't believe I'm doing that. And I'm on my sabbatical now and I'm working harder than I do, because I have more free time, I can get a lot more stuff done. And so if you have the passion, everything takes care of itself. If you don't have the passion, maybe you should think of, it's important early on to evaluate why you're doing what you're doing. And there's never anything wrong with taking a year off and taking a step back. I'm a huge believer that probably 85% of all high school seniors should probably take a year off, work for a year, maybe travel, get some real world experience in them, learn about time management. Because very often I see people that go right from high school to college because they don't know what else to do. And they aren't mature enough for college yet. They fail out after 2 semesters, they have student debt, and they're discouraged from ever coming back, and that's just terrible. I think a lot of them would be better served by taking a year off. You're young, you're not losing anything. You'll come in, be more prepared, you'll be more successful, and quite frankly, probably get through in about the same amount of time, because you'll go through in 4 years plus the year off as compared to 5 years if you didn't know what you're doing and you messed around. Arizona is right next to the Air Force Base, Davis Moth is. So one of my favorite group of students is DM is where the Air Force pararescue guys are headquartered. And they're kind of like the Air Force SEALs. They're the ones that jump behind lines to bring in pilots. And these guys are all super smart and super cool. And so when they get in their late 20s, they typically are like master sergeants. And they're retiring. And a lot of them go on to become trauma surgeons because they're good under pressure and they do that. And so I always get a couple in class, and they're really fun because they kind of blend in. They may have big tattoos and big muscles, but they kind of blend in. And I remember one came to me, and the students were complaining about an exam, and he just shook his head and says, I was in Fallujah, and I don't know what they're complaining about. So I really enjoy having mature students as well, because I think that their life experience has put them in a better position. And by the way, I think the same thing often holds true for grad school. I don't think there's anything wrong, because a lot of graduate programs, if you get admitted and say, I'm planning on doing this internship or doing 6 months of field work on my own in Australia, they're happy to have it, because you'll come back and we'll be a little bit better focused and have a better sense of self. And I think we need to do more of that in education. Mm-hmm. I think time off is critical, as opposed to just forcing your way through because there's inertia and you're not really thinking, why am I taking this next step?
Yeah. It's really nice to hear all of that, because I feel like that's contrary to a lot of what the narrative is, I guess, surrounding education. Like from high school through undergrad to graduate school is just push forward, keep going, don't stop. If you stop, you won't come back.
Well, I'm even more heretical in that I think that a lot of high school students would be much better served going in the trades. And by that I mean, for example, I have a friend of mine has a granddaughter who's a welder. Mm-hmm. And she makes more than I do, and she should. That's a really, really valuable skill. So if you think about it, you're in high school, you're not sure what you want to do. If you do an internship and learn a trade in 1 or 2 years, become a plumber or an electrician or a welder, you'll be making out the door $60,000 to $80,000 or more a year with no student debt and go anywhere in the country. Do that for a couple of years, get excited about something, you got some money behind you, got some work experience, come back and go to college. Yeah. I think we mistakenly devalue the trades. And I don't mean that I'm not saying that you're not smart enough for college. Quite the opposite. I think you can do a lot of stuff and get a lot of resources right now that'll put you in an even better position to succeed if you decide to go to college later on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great point, honestly. Yeah.
And I had no idea about trade school. I remember actually having this conversation probably 2 weeks ago with some people that I went to high school with, that nobody really talks about the alternative to going to get a 4-year degree from a university. When you're in high school, you don't know about the other options.
Statistically speaking, you're much better off. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously lots of variation, but after 5 years, you're much better off financially if you've gone into a trade. Mm-hmm. You have no debt. You're making, like I said, $80,000 to $100,000 a year or more, depending upon your field. Mm-hmm. Go anywhere in the country. Often have somewhat flexible hours. And it used to be, and I can see early on there was, the issue of looking at you and saying, well, given your phenotype, you should go into trades. Mm-hmm. That's terrible. But we've gone full circle in saying that no one should do that. It's for losers. When in fact, I mean, think about it. Someone has to do the milling for these microphones, right?
Yeah,
someone has
absolutely.
to do the carpeting in here. Mm-hmm. And those are I view those as high value jobs. Those jobs have the same merit as yours or my jobs. In fact, we have our jobs because of people like that.
Yeah.
And so I'm just always grateful for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think in academics, we often lose sight because we're narrowly focused, and there is, unfortunately, an elitist component. Not as much at state schools, but at some of the other schools, that it can get a little bit too overboard. And, we don't realize that everyone has a unique skill and talent to offer.
Yeah. Even within the biological sciences, sometimes there can be some amount of elitism between people that, like Emmarie said, are in like different camps or view themselves in separate components of biology. We're all studying more or less the same thing, especially in the genetics and genomics program. Like everything is made of A's, T's, G's, and C's that we're talking about here. So it's interesting.
One thing to think about is think about the best people in your field. Don't tell me who they are, but think about them. If you think about the best people, one of the traits you usually have is they're usually pretty self-effacing and pretty modest. They're not, obviously they have a big ego. Obviously they have a high sense of self-worth. But if you think about the people you met that are kind of arrogant and pushy, they're not the best people. They're kind of like the B- people. So I always tell grad students, act like you're one of the best people. Be nice to others. Never be afraid to ask questions. That's a huge thing. And the other best advice I can give any grad student is everyone their first year in grad school says, why am I here? Everyone's so much smarter. And that's because they were you 3 years ago, and they've been studying their butts off for 3 years, and they seem much smarter, and you'll be them in 3 years. So, and because people feel oftentimes like they don't belong, they don't ask questions. Faculty, admire grad students more that ask questions like, well, why is this a one-sided test as opposed to a two-sided test? Everybody's thinking that, nobody's asking that. When you ask it, all the students will be relieved, and instructor can go through. So I think we need to foster more of don't be afraid to ask questions. You can always ask questions among your peers. You should be encouraged to do that. But if you can ask questions among your peers, you can also ask questions, maybe after lecture if you're not that, or, but never hesitate asking questions. I'm really ignorant about a bunch of things, and I ask stupid questions to other people all the time.
Are you ever intimidated as somebody who's sort of crossing disciplines and talking to a lot of different people? Is it ever intimidating to ask the questions to you, or when did you kind of feel comfortable doing that?
It's not intimidating. What I do find, it's really funny when I go into a new area, like recently I'm looking at this method called Mendelian randomization that's used in human genetics. So for example, one of the questions people ask is, there's a correlation between drinking level and who you marry. Now, is that because you both drink? Is that because you have a socioeconomic level which causes you to get together and drink, or are there genes involved? That if you assortatively mate, you also do. So one way, obviously you can't do a randomized control experiment. What you can do is you can look at SNPs which are involved in alcohol tolerance. And you can simply say, if you have a SNP for, if you share a SNP for alcohol tolerance, are you more likely to get married? So among couples, you can ask, do they have an excess number of shared SNPs for alcohol tolerance that has nothing to do with alcohol? That logic is called Mendelian randomization. So when I first started reading that literature, it made no sense. It was just like, what's going on here? But I persisted. And then, as usually happens, all of a sudden one day it was like, this stuff is so obvious. What was I worried about? Because it takes a while for your brain, when you cram all that stuff in there, to kind of have it spit out and spin around, and all of a sudden just a little thing clicks and everything falls into place. The biggest mistake people make is when they read something, they're assuming something else, right? They think of that and they get hung up on the wrong thing, and it takes a while for your brain to kind of get off of that. So I always get intimidated working in new fields because it just makes no sense, and how did these guys figure this out? And then, oftentimes a bit later, and this is not true for me, it's true for most people. If you stay at it, think about stuff when you first saw it, it's like it made no sense. And now it's like second nature.
Yeah.
And that's just the persistence. So persistence is, don't give up because something's hard. That should be a challenge. And think of how much more satisfying it'll be when you get through that something hard. And even better yet, we can explain it to someone else who was in your position a year ago, because you'll know where you get hung up. Oh no, you really want to think about it this way, not that way, and it'll make it much clearer.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm glad that you said that, actually, because the way that I've explained this to people before, so my little sister just started her PhD program, and something that I've said when she says she doesn't understand something, say that like a professor she's rotating with mentions or a concept, I talk about your background brain, that I'm like, even if you're not actively thinking about it, if you sort of read something and it's high level and you're not sure that you understood it completely, if you let it kind of marinate for a little while, sometimes after a while it starts to click, which is also why I tell the first years in our program to get a hobby, something that is unrelated to science, to let your background brain do the work. So I'm happy to hear that validated, that it's not just a silly little thing that I say.
Well, I find I often have the most clarity when I could go running or go exercise, because your brain is processing and get a lot of blood flow, and at the end, all of a sudden, a lot of stuff that was kind of fuzzy now clicks.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, I think that's when I train my undergraduates about how to study, I say, number one, don't study for more than an hour straight. It's counterproductive. Like rereading the notes for 4 hours isn't going to work.
Yeah.
What you want to do basically is, maybe exercise beforehand so you're kind of fresh and relaxed. Read the material and then go exercise after. And as you're exercising, your mind is kind of putting that together. And then come back again and read it again. All of a sudden, it makes a lot more sense. I think there's a tendency you have to sit down and study. And you have to have a consistent place to study. You don't want to have, death German metal playing in the background, unless it's some people have white noise music, and white noise music is always great. Like you put the Bee Gees on and loop it and just drives you crazy, but you don't think of anything else. I don't do that, but I know people that do that.
That was my next question, is if the Bee Gees was your study.
And don't ask me to sing Night on Disco Mountain either. The other thing is, by the way, it's important, everyone learns things differently, and everyone has different insights. So when I give a lecture, I try to talk about the same subject from 2 different or 3 different viewpoints. So I tend to be repetitive, but it's intentional, and I'm trying to give it, here's side A, and here's side B, and here's side C, because some people get side A, some people don't get side A, but get side B, and the same, with your fellow students. And that's the people you learn the most from as a grad student are your fellow students, because you're comfortable. You'll talk about odd stuff. You have a diverse enough background. You'll talk about different things. So it's really important to socialize and talk science. And you don't want to only talk science when you socialize, but it's important to do that, to make that broader community. Mm-hmm. And the larger that net in terms of subject area, the more interesting it is.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was going to say, I actually have a friend who studies primate behavior over in another department, and it's always fun when we get together and like talk about science, because coming from a comparative genomics standpoint, I have a different perspective on like why these behaviors are arising and like what implications they may have compared to his perspective, which is like much more ecologically focused. So I feel like we can drive questions back and forth about each other's like research. So
we all by our training all get canalized. So
yeah,
for example, it's always a bad idea to go to grad school where you got your undergraduate, if you can help it. I mean, the exceptions are if you were, let's say, an entomology major, and then you moved over into, an EEB on a different topic. But people get canalized into thinking about things a certain way. Mm-hmm. Nothing wrong with that because it works for them. But because they get so focused on thinking about things a certain way, it's often hard to break out of that. Because you resist that, right? That's the confirmation bias. If you see an odd fact, you try to twist it into your worldview. There's nothing wrong with that, but you need outside perspectives to constantly probe and test that. Well, how do you account for this observation? Blah, blah, blah. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And they go, how about this? They go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Well, that does make sense. So you want to kind of avoid, talking to the same group, preaching to the choir.
So I have a question about that, because you kind of gave advice, I guess, to like incoming grad students or students who are thinking about possibly attending grad school. Like maybe you want to consider like really fostering those passions and like taking a little bit of time off to like discover who you are. But for grad students who are like later in their careers and maybe thinking about postdocs, I've sometimes heard that like you maybe want to go to a postdoc, you're not necessarily doing the same thing that you did during your Ph.D.
That's exactly right. So
okay.
The way to think about it is, the analogy I have is you have a big toolbox, right? The more tools you have in there, the more you'll be hired. If all you have is a hammer, you can't fix a toilet very well, right? And so I always think about that as having more tools. So I think it's a really good idea to do a postdoc that's not orthogonal, but maybe it's like 60 degrees away. So there's some commonality, but it's so different. That way in jobs, you can advertise yourself as I'm a behavioral ecologist, or I'm a comparative genomicist, I'm a museum systematist, I'm a morphometician. And getting that different experience is really going to give you a different set of way to think about things, different set of tools. It'll be challenging the first year, but it'll, in the long run, really be worth it. And likewise, when you're looking for jobs, is never let the job description get in your way of applying, right? If they say they want a fish ecologist and you work on lizards, put a good application in. The worst they'll do is they'll ignore it. And maybe they'll go, wow, this is really good. We should keep this person in mind when our HERP position opens next year. You don't know. So don't be constrained by kind of looking at, what the job, just if you think there's a job you could fit into and would fit into nicely and you'd like to do that, by all means apply. In terms of postdoc, you should think about where you want to apply, start thinking about a year and a half out. So that way you've got, 4 to 6 months to contact the lab, talk to them, get in touch with them. Then you've got about a year to try to worry about funding or have them worry about funding or both of you worry about funding. Don't wait till like a month before.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And also, if there's a couple labs you want to go to as a postdoc, by all means arrange to visit. That's really worthwhile. See if it makes sense for you. Talk to people in the lab. Maybe they'll get more excited about you. Maybe you'll realize that this isn't what it looked like on the web. Maybe you'll go, I love the lab, but I don't think I could live here. Or you go, lab's okay, but wow, look at all the other resources around here. This would be a fabulous place for me.
Yeah.
So I think you always want to, just like you probably both came out to interview for grad school, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You should do the same thing for a postdoc.
That's great advice.
Yeah. You have a lot of good advice and sort of insight about both the way that you choose the sort of focus that you have as a scientist or even just as a person, I guess, in the professional world, but also for students. Did you know that you wanted to be a professor and someone who engaged with students?
Never thought about it.
No?
I applied to one undergraduate school and one grad school.
Wow. Wow.
Just I didn't think about it. I thought, I just enjoy this and it's fun. So, I hadn't realized Davis was fairly hard to get into, and I hadn't realized that the genetics program at UW was really hard to get into. I just thought it was a genetics program. This sounds good, and it has all the right people for me.
Awesome.
So, again, if you really enjoy what you're doing, it's kind of naive in that regard, but I really enjoyed what I was doing. Mm-hmm. If you really enjoy what you're doing and you're passionate about it, if you're passionate, you'll put the time in. You'll learn to be a craftsperson in the field. You'll want to learn new things because it'll give you better insights. And if you come into any field with that, your drive will kind of take care of itself. Because you want to learn things. You want to interact with the best people. You want to be challenging. You want to put yourself in uncomfortable situations to learn stuff. So if you have a passion for whatever it is, if it's playing an instrument or, doing biology or studying dung beetles, everyone's different. And I admire people with passion. I sometimes don't understand why they do something, but I find that actually fascinating that what people's hobbies are. I'm a moth collector, so I should speak about odd hobbies.
Interesting.
But I admire people that have a real passion for things. My wife is a beater. There's a style called kumihimo. It's the same style that they bead for samurai armor. And so she's just got an absolute passion for that, and I really appreciate that.
Fascinating.
You do have to have a... So if you have... passion gets you through a lot of stuff because it gives you the drive to study and to learn and to be excited and to probe and to spend those extra 6 hours in the field when everyone else is tired. You just don't want to leave because it's so interesting, right? That's how you're successful. And if you find what you're doing you don't have passion in, there's something out there you have passion for, you just haven't found it yet. So don't despair. Sample a wider plate and see what gets you excited.
I was going to ask, has there ever been a time, and this, I don't mean to be weird when I ask this, but have you ever felt like burnt out or felt like there was a little bit of your passion disappearing? And if so, how did you refoster that?
Oh yeah, when you finish teaching a lecture of intro bio and you get a bunch of blank states with no questions, and but then you get great questions from those few students in there, and it comes right back again. Someone mentioned a hobby. I think it's really, really important. So, for example, insect collecting is something I've published a couple of papers on, but naming species, not any hardcore research, because it gives me, I was told a long time ago as a biologist, you want to have a model system you really understand so you can go back and frame questions in the sense of that system. Like insects, how do they find mates? How do they find their host plants? How do they survive parasites and parasitoids and predators? And so when you think about that, it makes you think about problems differently. But also, it's a break from that. And oftentimes in your hobby, your subconscious is processing stuff in your work, and sometimes your subconscious is processing stuff in your hobby. And I think it's important to have something a little bit different. So, maybe it's music or, maybe it's martial arts or something like that. But having that different thing you do that's disconnected from your science gives you a break and actually helps you process and do better because your mind's always working. It's just when you're doing something else, it's free to work on in the background on the problem you're trying to tackle.
Yeah.
Have you ever been in a position where you took a look at the sort of work you were doing or the job you were doing and you weren't sure that the passion was there anymore? Like, have you ever called it into question and been like, what exactly is it that I'm doing? And like, how do I realign with what I'm interested in? Or do you feel like you've always been on like a trajectory of passion for what it is that you enjoy?
I would kind of say no, but what I do is I'm always dynamically adjusting it.
Okay.
Subconsciously. Mm-hmm. Like for example, when I write these big textbooks, like I'll do a whole chapter on quantitative genomics. So eQTLs and regulatory QTLs. And so I get really focused on that in passion and dig in the literature. And then I turn right around and have to write one on matrix decomposition. So I just, change, and then I get excited about those papers. And so I'm switching the goal, but that's because the target goal has shifted on that. And the fun part is then you go back and you put all those connections together because you've studied them. That's the real fun part.
That's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. Do you have any hobbies or activities besides bug collecting?
Well, I'm a random sports watcher.
Okay.
Including things such as cricket and stuff like that.
Interesting.
That's a bug. No, I'm kidding.
No, cricket means I can have an instant conversation with anyone on the Indian subcontinent. People don't realize that cricket is the second most popular sport in the world.
Yeah, that is
soccer,
true.
cricket, basketball, baseball.
Random
Because
sports, so
you think about it, right? You've got India, Pakistan, basically all the formal British colonies, South Africa, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, New Zealand, Australia, and they have one thing in common: they love to beat the bloody pommies. So a cute little fact. So in cricket, the most prestige trophy is called the Ashes. And it's when England and Australia play, which is every other year. And the Ashes trophy, and the saga goes, and someone can, listening to this can get on the web and find the correct truth. But I think England lost, and they were so disheartened by the fact they lost, they burned the cricket ball and saved the Ashes. So the Ashes trophy is this big.
oh my god.
And it's the most prized trophy in cricket, because it contains allegedly, and now it's a bigger thing, but the Ashes is literally about 2 inches tall.
Oh my god.
That's cool.
Never would have
and
known that.
petty, honestly.
So I just didn't. One of the things about sports is it tells you a lot about culture. So things on my life list of things to do, I haven't done yet. I'd really love to go see a AAA soccer game in Brazil, and I know people are able to do that. I'd love to see a cricket match in both India and also, believe it or not, a big cricket country, at least historically, is the West Indies, Jamaica, that area. And that would be fun to see a game. I had great fun, and my wife did too, seeing a baseball game in Korea. It's totally different. It's amazingly fun. I'd highly recommend anyone who's never done it to go see a baseball game in Korea. It's just totally different. Same game, but just a huge amount of fun. You'll really enjoy it. And the pageantry of like college football and sports is always interesting. When I have foreign visitors over, I always try to get them to a college football game so they get the tailgating experience. And it's not A&M crazy, but just that college football experience is really unique to America. And sports are a reflection of culture, and it's really kind of fun it's a great way to get immersed in that culture. And the nice thing is, in a sporting event, everyone's the same, right? The cultural barriers, unless you're rooting for the other team, the cultural barriers are, largely gone, because even though you're different and may think differently or talk or look differently, you've got a common goal, and you can, relate to that and revel in that. And it just makes you realize that, we worry so much on trivial differences between us when you pick two random people off the planet, and they all have the same thing in common, right? They want success with their family and their friends and their community. And that's a universal feature. I mean, they have different ways of getting there, but and sports are a way to realize that, and to realize that common sense that you have, that common sense of purpose of making sure the Longhorns just get totally shut out coming up. I think it's Thanksgiving.
Yep, I think
Also,
that's right.
you also want A&M to score a lot so the Corps cadets can get their kiss after each touchdown.
Oh, yes, right.
That's
I forgot
important
about that one.
for student morale.
I'm a 2%er, I'll be honest. Probably shouldn't reveal that on the podcast.
Sorry to the Aggies that are listening.
Yeah, sorry for the disappointment. Are you familiar with what a 2%er is? It is someone who has not been indoctrinated into the Aggie tradition, so I don't really know anything.
The 2%ers use at a lot of universities for a lot of different things.
Oh, well.
But it does refer to someone outside of the cultural environment.
Yeah.
But like I said, I mean, any culture has things which are really cool and things which are kind of creepy. Like I'll just say about A&M, I won't say the creepy part. I'll say the cool thing is that there's this great sense of community, and that's actually really wonderful. And that's very clear and very permeates to it. And you have this community that extends, past generations. You show your Aggie ring, you're a made man or woman because of that.
Yeah.
And so that's a really nice feature.
The one other question I had really quickly, you have described a species of moth. I was wondering if you could tell us the story behind that.
So I've described about 20 species.
Okay, so that's a few. Sorry, not one.
And if you look at the back of my phone, the 3 moths on there are all named Walshi. They're all named after me. But the first moth I described, this is a great story, Lithopain leae, Leeae. My wife's name is Lee. She drives a pink Tacoma pickup.
Awesome.
So I found a new species, very distinct, of moth with a bright pink hindwing. I had to name it after her.
So romantic.
I want to love like that.
And even better, the description says the type specimen is a singular female festooned in pink. because it's known from, at the time of discovery, it was the rarest insect in the world. It wasn't unique because it was only known from one individual. It's now in the Canadian National Collection. During COVID, we found a second one. And the idea is not that they're rare, it's the way you collect moths is you put a light trap and they come to lights. And for whatever reason, these things just don't come to lights. And a lot of moths do that. There's a lot out there you never see because they just don't come to lights, and I got lucky once. So that's the story of Lithopain lei. If you Google pink moth Arizona, you'll pick it up. And
That's
I remember,
so sweet.
but there's an even funner story. I was actually listening to radio. I wanted to call in, but I didn't. One of our local disc jockeys was talking about this new pink moth being discovered in Arizona, and he said, he killed Tinkerbell. Jokingly, of course. I was tempted to call in and said, damn straight I did. So that's that. And I've had several others. The ones have been named after people. I have a good collecting buddy named Ray Nagel, so I named a nice moth after him. And my major professor, Joe Felsenstein, is the one that basically reset all the way you do phylogenies with statistics. He's kind of the original gangster in that area, the OG. And one of his first papers was on long branch attractions. If you have a divergence on a phylogenetic tree and use parsimony methods, fewest number of changes, long branches attract together, which is unnatural, and they should. So Eupheus felsensteini is a large noctuid moth, and what does it have on the forewing? A long branch.
That's so great.
What I took away from this entire thing is that if you make friends with someone who discovers a lot of really cool insects, you might get one named after you.
Yes, so my couple of favorite examples. There's a sponge called Squarepansensis. Mark Knopfler of the Dire Straits has dinosaur named after him because people would his grad students claimed they found more dinosaur bones than Dire Straits was playing. And a colleague of mine from University of Chicago named a bird lice Gary Larsonensis after Gary Larson of The Far Side.
Wow.
That's great.
So they're interesting stories. So the way the three were named after me is that I caught them, knew they were distinct. You never name something after yourself. That's poor taste. What you do is you give it to your best friend, and your best friend gives you one, and you name them after each other. Yeah. And that's totally kosher. That's perfectly fine. Now, moths are easy because there's 17,000 species. Getting like a mammal named after you, there's 6,000 mammals worldwide or something?
Yeah, 6,000.
And, birds are about 10,000. So, those are or butterflies, that's the real cachet. But all the moths named after me are nice and colorful, so I'm happy.
Awesome.
Nice. I was going to say, I have a friend who actually studies springtails and
Yeah, call them up. Those are.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to have one named after you, would you?
Well, he does. Okay. So, yeah. He also named one where the scientific name translates to firebutt, and I think that's really cute. So, anyways, on that note.
On that note, thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Walsh. It's been awesome. Today's episode was hosted by Emmarie Alexander and myself, Serina DeSalvio, and produced by Aaron DeSalvio. This podcast is brought to you by the Texas A&M University Interdisciplinary Graduate Program in Genetics and Genomics. If you have any questions about our program here at A&M, please feel free to email us at bluejeansandboots@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and X @GeneticsPodcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.